And good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome back. And I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. I hope your festivities were, hello, Barry. I hope that your festivities were joyous. I hope you managed to get together with as many of your loved ones as you could under the circumstances. I know I did because I went to Ireland and I went to the UK and I met just about everybody in my family, and it was wonderful. And I got to play with my grandchildren after 2 years. By God, they grew quickly. Anyway, so welcome back, and hello, David. Very warmest New Year wishes to you and to everybody else on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world, because we did do an audit of last year's webinar achievements, and we're very proud of the fact that we are not only being watched, not necessarily live, but on the YouTube channel all across America, in various parts of the UK and Ireland, but also in Australia and India and Poland and Germany and various, I can't remember, I think there's about 8 countries that tune into us. So we're really proud of that, and thank you all. And I wish you all, hello Shelley, I wish you all a very, very happy and hopefully Omicron-free New Year. I just had a little scare, but got back my negative result, thank goodness. So I'm all right. I've just got my annual chest infection. It's like an old friend. I start coughing and I cough for a month and then it goes away again. And let us pray that it continues to go away. Anyhow, welcome back, as I say. One particular notice, and it's Omicron related. For those of you in Pittsburgh, because of the current very high occurrence, and it hasn't peaked yet, but we're reliably informed, or as reliable as any information can be with regard to COVID, that it should peak at the end of January. So we have moved our production of Endgame, of Samuel Beckett's Endgame. It was meant to be in February. We've now moved it end of April, beginning of May. And anybody who bought tickets, there's the information. Those are the performance dates. Anybody who's booked tickets, your tickets will have been reallocated to the equivalent day on the next run. If you have a problem, don't hesitate to contact us. If you want to make an alteration, if you need to cancel your booking or whatever, just go to the website and or call the ticket hotline, and we will do our very, very best to satisfy your requirements. Speaking of the website, it's currently under reconstruction. It won't look enormously different. It will look somewhat different, but it will be infinitely more efficient. And that will be happening, I think, in the next week or so. But anyway, go to the website if you need information. That's Endgame dealt with. Okay, this week, I'm beginning a whole sequence on a more classic-based view of theatre, just to start the year off, because classic is our middle name. Irish and classic theatre. I can literally say that. Hello from Dublin, Grace. Good to hear from you. And John Henry, how are you? I hope you're well. There's Helen Fay, bless you. Good to see you always. And a happy new year to you. There's Pat from Oakland. Welcome back. And Gary from Verona, PA. I like Verona. I like that stretch of the Allegheny. It's rather lovely. Anyway, as I say, this week we're going to, I put it under the title 5-2, which is not a time nor a score. It is a location. And it is what I call part of the director's dilemma when directing Shakespeare, or indeed any play from that particular Elizabethan Jacobean period. And in fact, it went on beyond that as well. This tendency of these plays to be divided into a 5-act structure, which always leaves the director with a particular dilemma. Where do you put the intermission? Is there a natural point for an interval? Now, when all of the plays of Shakespeare and most of his contemporaries were written, they were written with an apparent 5-act structure or formula. Now, there is no clear indication of any other division or intermission. So it becomes incumbent on the director, who has is the final arbiter. When you do put a break into the action, but you need to put a break that is both appropriate and necessary. Now, of course, in modern days and with modern theatre, hello Fitzjamie, hello Alma. I keep saying hello because it'll break my thought, and I'm getting very old and my thought process starts to crumble. Anyway, where do you put a break in the action that is both appropriate and necessary? And in modern theatre, very often a break is considered necessary, especially by audience members, shall we say, of my vintage, when we do need a moment of a personal moment about halfway through the play, for reasons I will not explain, but you'll all understand. But there's a more important reason, about a psychological reason for where an intermission might go. What is its purpose? Because I do believe, and as I say, everything I tell you may be wrong, it's just what I think. I do believe that the correct structuring of an intermission, of an interval, of an interlude, helps with the drama itself. It helps with the performance, with the production. It helps to tell the story. And very often in classical opera, there would be interludes put in of a ballet, a dance, or something or the other, to give the audience a moment to sit back and take on board what they've been watching. Because one of the things about classic theatre, plays with huge casts and huge subject matter, I suppose that's actually true of any good play, is that you are bombarded with information, both visual, oral, intellectual. You're made to laugh, you're made to cry, but your mind is being bombarded with information. And it is of enormous value that you can actually take a moment and sit back and say, what have I just seen? What are the implications? Where could this go? So that when you come back after that break, after that, shall we say, that intellectual break, hopefully refreshed with a cup of coffee or a Jameson or something, that you are ready to take on board the conclusions that will come from the propositions that you have seen. I hope I make that clear. The first half of a play is about proposition. The second half of a play is about conclusion. Now, there are other divisions within that, as any good writing expert will tell you, about the building of the propositions, about the setting up of the scenes, about the setting up of the characters. But if you break it down to its fundamental 5-to-2 proportion, it's about setting up a proposition, setting up a conclusion. That's what the two represent. And in between the two, a moment for reflection and consideration. Now, frequently, such a break in the action is not where you might expect, because you would imagine, mathematically speaking, or to maintain perfect balance, and I will refer to one play of perfect balance in a moment, you would imagine that you would have, it's a game of two halves, both of the same duration, but it doesn't necessarily follow. Excuse me, the old chest. There is a sort of unwritten principle of theatre that the first half should always be slightly longer than the second half. It doesn't always work that way. But generally speaking, audiences seem to feel more comfortable if the second half doesn't take as long as the first half. So you also have that question in your mind when you're trying to decide, where does this break come? How does this break happen? And the 5-act structure of Shakespeare's and other allied writers doesn't always give you a clear indication. So this week I'm going to discuss the various options offered by some play texts, options which will enhance the action and the tension of the play and offer the audience that much needed break for a moment of quiet introspection when they can say, what have I just seen? Where is this leading me? What would I like it to be? How will the outcome happen? So, certain problems. Problem number one. Shakespeare probably didn't designate the acts. He might have designated the scenes, but the choices of the act and scene structure that we now understand came from the early editors of the folio and subsequent subsequent folios and subsequent publications. Editors often feel incumbent upon them to make the writer's work more readily understood. Writers do usually have long rows with their editors as to what they would like and what they wouldn't like, in, out, taken in, taken out. And this also falls on the director as well, because very often as directors we do not do the entire text. And there's a good reason for that. As most people know, it's a sort of given that a full-scale production of Hamlet is 5 hours long. I was once, when I was a young actor, in a full-length production of Romeo and Juliet, which was 4 hours and 45 minutes long. So very often a director will make that choice. What play am I going to take out of this text? What interpretation am I going to do? What can I discard? And what can I use to enhance the theme of this particular production? And anybody, let's take Hamlet as an example. I've probably seen Hamlet 50 times in my life. I've certainly directed it several times. It's never been the same twice. You make a choice. What Hamlet are you going to present? Or what Romeo and Juliet, or what Lear, or what any other play are you going to do? And you will edit it to that purpose. And later in the year, I'm going to have a webinar just discussing this notion of how and where you edit a play, and I hope to get a couple of other directors in on that discussion. However, we're going to just narrow it down to the intermission at this particular point. So if we assume, as we might, that Shakespeare didn't break it necessarily down into acts and scenes, how were the scenes designated in the originals? Because very often when you read Shakespeare and when you look at Shakespeare and when you rehearse Shakespeare, you realize that these scenes have a tendency to run on, that there isn't a stop, change the set, do something else. Shakespeare didn't have scenery. He had the globe, he had an empty stage. And when he went indoors to such places as the Blackfriars or presented plays at court, it would be a platform. So there was no need to stop the action to change the set. The scenes would tend to run on. And that run on is both wonderful and a dilemma, because you've got to, as I say, work out what point do you stop the run on to give the audience a moment to think. Problem number 2. Was there ever an intermission? Was, in the time of Shakespeare, the action usually continuous? We generally believe that it was. The audience was free to come and go, to move about. This notion of everybody sitting in their designated seat is a relatively modern one. And also the majority of the audience in Shakespeare's time was standing. The groundlings did not have, you had to pay a penny to get in to be a groundling. I think it was 2 pennies to sit in one of the boxes, bringing your own cushion. And if you were really well, you paid 3 pennies to sit on the stage with the actors. So it was a much more informal concept. And in the Elizabethan open roof theatres, places like the Globe and the Rose, performances were given in the daylight. They would probably start sometime after noon and continue until just prior to sunset, when there wouldn't be any light. Excuse me. So you wanted to continue your performance to make sure that everything encompassed the available light. When they moved into indoor theatres later on, like the Blackfriars Theatre, like the court halls and what have you, the performance was by candlelight. Slightly different experience, but nevertheless an audience that may or may not have sat still, may have moved around, may have gone out for a moment, a little bio break of their own or what have you. So it was a different concept of the presentation of a play. So the question arises, was there ever an intermission? One suspects that there was not, that the continuation of action was part of the process. Then there's the question of shape and plot, which comes to what I'm going to discuss in a future webinar, how to edit the play, cutting the text, to shape the plot the way that the director or the actors feel they want the play to go, what particular interpretation. And a particular interpretation is not simply how an actor reads the words, it's also how the company, how the actors, how the team, how the director, how the designers put together a clear and precise concept. Sometimes Shakespeare's plays were rewritten by Shakespeare. One classic example of that, when Wells and Taylor, two great, rather brilliant editors of modern editors of Shakespeare, put together the current Oxford edition of Shakespeare, they ended up presenting two different versions of King Lear, one which they called The History of King Lear and the other they called The Tragedy of King Lear, because from their analysis, it became clear to them that Shakespeare had at some point rewritten the play. And that's not unusual. Writers have been doing that since they began writing plays. A writer very often will write a play, look at it and see it in production and go, no, that's not what I intended, and rewrite it. I can think of several examples. I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but I can think of several examples in modern theatre where that has happened. I know I've done it myself because, as some of you know, I do adaptations of classic novels, and I don't think there's been one of them that I haven't rewritten after the first production. Because when seeing it in action, you realize mistakes you've made or opportunities you've missed. And I'm no doubt that a genius like Shakespeare would have had exactly that experience, that lines would change, scenes would change, structures would change. So with that in mind, what is the company of actors and the director attempting to do? For the modern audience, there are needs, just as I think there always have been for audiences, the need for the climactic moment to lead to an intermission, what we call the cliffhanger effect, the moment at which you stop the action, where the audience are gasping in delight or disbelief, and that will bring the audience back because they want to know what happens next. That's the oldest storytelling trick in the world. That goes back to when people first began to tell stories, when the man in his cave talking about being attacked by the bear stops to take a drink of water with the audience going, and what happened? And what happened? Ah, yeah, well, it was fine because I hid behind a rock. But the cliffhanger moment is intrinsic to the telling of a dramatic tale, whether that drama be comic or tragic. The cliffhanger moment is what matters. So when you're seeking out a point for intermission, that's one of the things you look for. Something that will make, after the break, the audience want to come back to answer that wonderful question, what happened next? Now, this can be a very complex choice in a brilliant play, in a well-written play. And the director, who is always the final arbiter of that particular choice, has various options to consider. What does the plot demand? What can the actors manage within reason? And what guidance does the author give us? Now, what does the plot demand? Well, if the plot is well composed and well structured, it will have led you to a point where the proposition has been completely made and the conclusion will then follow on. If the play is well written, it sort of teaches you where that moment will be. What can the actors manage within reason? I'll come into that very briefly, because we've got to remember that actors are human and there is energy demand upon the actor in performance. And there are limitations to the demands that a play can make upon an actor in terms of that energy output. An actor wants to achieve a point and then have a moment. And Shakespeare actually was very good about this. You'll notice that in all the major tragedies, his leading actors always get a break before the end of the play. Hamlet disappears off to England, and there's the whole sequence of the death of Ophelia and the return of Laertes where you don't see Hamlet at all. Shakespeare gives him a break. King Lear, you've got a whole sequence of the blinding of Gloucester and the leading of Gloucester to the cliff at Dover and Mad Tom and all of that before Lear comes back on with They Cannot Touch Me for Coining. Shakespeare gives him a break. Juliet gets a break with Romeo going off to Mantua. It always happens that there is this moment when the author says, you've seen enough of this person, you know what the proposition, we give them a break, we're going to continue with the plot line, and then we're going to bring them back at a significant moment, and then we'll lead on to the end. This is good technical structuring, that's all. And the director has to spot these and has to make use of them. And that's part of the guidance that the author is giving us with regard to when that intellectual break should come, that interlude. I'm going to call it an interlude because it may not be an intermission, but it will be an interlude. Now, King Lear is a very good example of the options. Many years ago, excuse me, I directed the wonderful English actor Timothy West as King Lear, and we had a debate. And the debate was, naturally, where do we put the intermission? And he believed that it should come at the moment when Goneril and Regan have thrown him out, and he's done his reason not the need speech, and he is being sent out into the storm, and Cornwall says to Gloucester, shut up your doors, and that's the intermission. And I disagreed, of course, because I maintain that that's not Shakespeare's intention. Because the line, the proposition of the first half of the play, which is in fact a little over the first half of the play, is that it is a line of descent for Lear from absolute power to absolute nothing. And that if you break that line of descent, you're doing a disservice to the structure of the play and the nature of the character. And that the true point of intermission comes at the end of the hovel scene. After he's met Mad Tom, after he's done blow winds and crack your cheeks, after all of that, when he's sitting in this hovel, down his entire court reduced to a fool and a madman. And he imagines he's putting his daughters on trial, and he sees his dogs barking at him in his imagination, that he has become nothing. And at that point, and remember, nothing was the significant word in the very first scene of the play. Nothing shall come of nothing, speak again. Lear must travel from absolute power to absolute nothing, and then, and only then, do you take an interlude. Only then. And you return without Lear having to come back on the stage. The audience is left guessing. You return to the blinding of Gloucester, you return to Gloucester being thrown out, you return to Mad Tom, Dover Cliff, all of that. We don't see Lear again until that whole sequence is complete. And when we do see him again, he's quite mad, stone mad. That was the result. Now, this was the argument I had with Tim. And at the time we were working, an old friend of Tim was also directing in Dublin, Jonathan Miller, very famous English director. And we were having lunch one day, and Miller said, no, I think Tim's right. And I said, well, I think Tim's wrong. And I think you're wrong. I was very presumptuous. I was much younger than now. I would never presume now. And I said, that was the mistake you took when you directed it with Michael Hordern, and when you directed it with Olivier. I think you're wrong. So Miller came to see the production, and I'm proud to say I won. But it is that decision that a director can take. The alternative decision is perfectly legitimate, but and as I say, everything I tell you may be wrong, I think it's the wrong choice. I think Shakespeare's intention is to see that descent, bring you to that point where you go out into an interlude thinking, what happens next? He's now hit his lowest point. What possibly can happen to him next? And when you come back, Shakespeare keeps you waiting and goes to a different plot line, a parallel plot line, but a different one. So Shakespeare divides the play himself into two very clear halves that aren't quite halves: decline into madness, return to self-realization. So I will believe always that the hovel scene is the natural break. And as I say, when it came to that production, I won the argument. Let's take another example. Julius Caesar. Now, we discussed Caesar in a previous webinar, And I'm going to keep coming back to Julius Caesar in the future, because I think it's a brilliantly conceived and structured drama. Julius Caesar has an apparent continuity of action. If you look at it, it is a plot to remove a potential dictator. We've discussed this. A plot to remove a potential dictator, to include all the reasonable thinking people, although everybody has their own selfish motives for doing it. The assassination of that leader, the replacement of that leader with a military junta and a civil war, and the conclusion being that everything that the conspirators attempted to achieve, they failed in, because the one thing they wanted, the restoration of the Republic, never happened, and they replaced it with a dictatorship under Augustus. So there's your single line going through that play, absolutely pure. But is there the potential for an interlude, an intermission? Yes. Now, if the first half of the play is about the killing of Caesar, one might assume that the moment of the killing of Caesar, the moment that Caesar falls, et tu, Brute, and that short piece of look what we've done, let's wash our hands in the blood, let's proclaim proudly what we've done it all for Rome, that might be a legitimate moment to put the break in the play. Caesar is dead. What happens next? And that's a legitimate option. It would mean that the play would be slightly second half heavy, but it's a legitimate option. However, I do think that there is a better one, and the one that I would go for, because I would look at it saying, what there are two results of this assassination, one immediate and one long term. And what Shakespeare wants us to concentrate on is both. So you must have a clear distinction between the two. Now, in our previous talk about Julius Caesar, I talked about the two great funeral orations and the politics behind them. And the third scene that I mentioned was what I consider one of the most hideous and horrible and brilliant scenes that Shakespeare ever wrote, which is the killing of Cinna the poet, mob rule. Because I believe that the purpose of the first half, the proposition section, is showing that a conspiracy against a leader and an assassination of that leader will lead to mob rule. And once the mob is out, it is very difficult to contain them democratically. And in the play, after the assassination, you have these two wonderful funeral orations in which Mark Antony manages to incite the mob. And he does it the way many a political leader will. He'll look at their greed. He'll first make them sentimental and approach their grief, tell them that they're grieving because they don't realize it, and then their greed by saying, and look at Caesar's will, he's left every single one of you a load of money. He's opened up all his gardens and parks. He's given you Rome. He has given you so much that way. And of course, the mob go crazy. And that's, I think, to my mind, Shakespeare's intention for the first half, for the proposition, because the proposition of that first half leads to the mob tearing Cinna the poet apart. These, if you like, are the dogs of war that Mark Antony talks about. The moment it's actually at the end of Act 3 as we have it designated, the death of Cinna the poet. But it's a brilliant demonstration of what a coup, a rebellion can do. So if you like, the murder of Cinna the poet is the natural conclusion of the assassination of Caesar. The assassination of Caesar released the dogs of war, released the mob. And the conclusion of that first proposition is when you assassinate a leader, the mob takes over and there is chaos. The dogs of war are out. And to my mind, that is the perfect moment for the break, for the interlude, for the audience to consider what they've seen, to reflect on what has happened, to look at what rebellion has unleashed, and to ask themselves that very important question: what happens next? All hell has broken loose. Caesar is dead. There is no control. There is no government. There is no one ruling. The conspirators have all fled. Nobody's in charge except the mob. What happens next? So there is your natural moment. That is the point at which the interlude, where the audience can collect their thoughts, reconsider what has happened, and ask that all-important question. Because after that break, we come back and meet a new military dictatorship. A dictatorship that is already drawing up a list of those to be executed. It's pure Stalin-esque. Again, just like Shakespeare must have read Beckett, I think Shakespeare must have read the history of Stalin. This is exactly what will happen. That once the normal process has been abused and mobs rule, it is replaced always with a military dictatorship. And if you don't believe me, just look around the world. You will see it happening. So there you have, in that play, Shakespeare has designated, I think, a very clear pattern of proposition and conclusion. Now, not just in the heavyweight plays, those of you who joined us, we recently presented a production of As You Like It. Now, here is an example of, for my mind, perfect form. I think As You Like It is one of those perfectly formed plays. Shakespeare leads us into a very complex world of banishment and love. And as I talked about before, the way As You Like It is set up could almost lead to a tragedy, but it doesn't. It leads to a comedy. But you've got these two simple propositions. People are banished and people fall in love. And to create this world, to create the proposition of the play, he has to assemble a very diverse group of people, very diverse group of characters into one somewhat idyllic setting. He has to bring the banished and the lovers all together under the roof of the forest and let them interact and let these propositions form themselves of what does banishment mean? Well, to the old Duke, it means actually not a bad thing. They've gone back to nature. They're living in the forest. They're living the good life. They're killing the deer, the way you do, and eating the fruits and the vegetables of the forest, and they're all perfectly happy. The banished young women who are in hiding their identity. One of them pretending to be a boy, the other pretending to be a shepherdess, rather badly, let it be said. And you have the lovers of the forest, the people in the forest, the Silviuses, the Phoebes, and what have you, all coming together under this umbrella of the forest. This is the proposition, setting up this whole notion. And Orlando, also banished, because his brother will kill him if he stays where he is, going to the forest, suffering the anguish of unrequited love, and meeting this young boy who says, I'll cure you. I'll fix this. I'll make everything okay. I will beat love out of you, because the suffering of love is awful. And the prospect of not having to suffer this love is intriguing. And there is your proposition, that the moment of interlude comes through this proposition that all things can be made well. This is a thing that's playing itself almost as a tragicomedy. And there are lots of opportunities within it for the director to choose where to put an interlude. But to my mind, it is only when all the players in, as the Duke describes it, this wild and universal stage are fully assembled that a break can take place. When we have realized that what we are seeing is a representation of the whole world, of suffering, of joy, of love, of fear, of dread. Everything is there, all summed up in Jaqui's rather wonderful All the World's a Stage speech, where he's merely describing, this is just life. This is what we all go through, and these are the stages of it. And also that the hero Orlando has entered into the game of love offered by Ganymede, this young boy who happens to be the girl he loves, Rosalind. Strange that he doesn't recognize her, but it is Shakespeare. So to my mind, the only logical place for an intermission must come not at the end of an act, but halfway through an act. It's at the end of Act 3, Scene 2. The moment when Orlando agrees to join in the game with Ganymede, and Ganymede says to Orlando, nay, but you must call me Rosalind. And at that moment, again, to use Conan Doyle, the game's afoot. The proposition has been set up. Everything, all the right people are assembled in the right place under that wonderful umbrella of the forest. And Orlando has agreed to enter the game. The proposition is complete, and the conclusion will be, how does the game play out? And that intermission comes halfway through an act. And that happens quite frequently, to my mind. And I keep saying to my mind because, as I say, everything I tell you may be wrong. It's just my opinion. In The Merchant of Venice, for instance, there is, again, a perfect moment of the conclusion of the proposition. We start a play with Shylock wanting to be one of the guys, wanting to be just a merchant like the Merchant of Venice, Antonio, wanting to say, I'll lend you money, I'll do it. And I believe, here's a joke, I won't take any interest, pledge a pound of flesh. I think it's almost done as a joke. Certainly Shylock resents the way he's been treated, but he does want to be part of the gang. Well, everything that can go wrong does go wrong. And he is constantly abused, and he is constantly having to defend himself. And the proposition is constantly being put forward, you are different. You are not one of us. So much so that the Christians steal away or seduce his daughter, and she steals his money, his jewelry, everything, to go away with the Christians. And a resentment builds up and builds up and builds up in Shylock. Parallel to that, Portia, the heroine, is stuck with a dilemma. She is trapped in the conditions of her father's will. She can only marry somebody who makes the right choice between these three ridiculous caskets. She cannot marry for love. She can only marry according to the father's will. I think Shakespeare here was also making a commentary on the fact that that was generally the case. But as with Shakespeare, love will always find a way. And somebody turns up that she does want to marry. Finally. And at this point, which is parallel to Shylock's descending dilemma, is Portia's constantly growing frustration. And it comes together in the third act. And at the end of Act 3, Scene 1, Shylock comes to a decision. And that decision is rather beautifully constructed. He's being abused. He's being ridiculed. He comes to define what he is, that he is just a man like anybody else, who does not deserve this. And then his friend Tubal comes on and tells him that Antonio is in trouble. And Shylock is delighted, but he also tells him that his daughter Jessica is spending all his money. And then this final moment, she gave a jewel to buy a monkey. And Shylock has this moment of ultimate realization. That was my turquoise. I had it of Lear when I was a bachelor. It was that jewel that his wife gave to him, probably a pledge of love. I would not have given it for a wilderness of monkeys. It's that final tipping point, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And at that moment, he chooses to avenge himself. And for the first time, he uses a word, Meet me at our synagogue, Tubal. He now needs to avenge himself and his tribe for the abuse that's been given to him. And that, to my mind, is the moment of interlude, so that the audience can have that period to consider where Shylock has come from and why he's arrived at that decision. And you begin the second half, the conclusion, with a scene where Portia, realizing she wants Bassanio, and gets him because he makes the right choice. And interestingly, she gives him a ring as a pledge. It is a complete echo. It was my turquoise. I had it of Lear when I was a bachelor. So Shakespeare's structuring it in such a way that you bring it to a conclusion, or bring the proposition to an end, and begin the conclusion with an echo, if you like. So again, it would seem to me that the correct place for an intermission there is at the end of Act 3, Scene 1. By placing the interval here, you are demonstrating the perfect balance of the play. Othello, another example. There are several opportunities for shaping it, with a multitude of climactic moments. That play, which I think is the greatest love story ever written for the theatre, it's riddled with climactic moments. At the end of Act 2, for instance, Iago finally reveals his plan to destroy Cassio and to condemn Desdemona. It's a perfect the plot thickens moment. Perhaps too early for a break. Not enough action has happened apart from a very drunken fight where Cassio thinks he's lost his reputation. But at the end of Act 3, Scene 2, again, halfway through one of the presented acts, there is an exceptionally long scene between Othello and Iago. And much of the plan comes together in that scene. This is the scene when Iago's duplicity and genius shines forth. He's dropped doubt into Othello's mind about Desdemona. And then there arrives the fatal handkerchief. His wife says, "Look what I found. Give it back." Everything is going Iago's way. Othello's doubt turns to anger, and from anger to a desire for revenge. Othello's gullibility comes to its highest point, just as Iago's ingenuity comes to its highest point. The two things come together to coalesce into this agreement to kill. Iago, you can see, is at his finest moment of deception. And in that moment, he pledges himself entirely to Othello's service. It comes to a point of climax when Othello has said, "I will be revenged. I will have my revenge. Nothing will stop me. I am going to do this. I am going to punish. I am going to be revenged." And Iago, at that moment, pledges himself entirely to Othello. And the line, "I am your own forever," is one of the best intermission lines ever written. That is the moment when the break takes place, because the proposition is complete. From that point on, it is the execution of the conclusion. There is nothing new. There are no new propositions. Now we put it all into practice. We lead it to the ultimately and horrifically tragic conclusion. There is another best intermission lines ever. I think it may even be the best. And it's in Romeo and Juliet. And it's not even at the end of a scene, let alone the end of an act. It's actually a line in the middle of a scene. But it is the perfect moment. It's in Act 3, Scene 1. Now, in that scene, the proposition is complete. Romeo has met Juliet. Romeo has wooed Juliet. We've had the balcony scene. They have met the next day. There has been lots of funny discussion. The nurse has set up the meeting. They go to the friar. They get married. And everything is wonderful. On the return from the wedding, having married Juliet, comes into the square, into the piazza, and there arrives Tybalt. And Tybalt, the angry Tybalt, challenges Romeo to a duel. And Romeo, for some reason, says, "No, I love you more than you can possibly imagine." And Romeo's friend Mercutio cannot understand this, because Mercutio is as much of a hothead as Tybalt is, and decides to fight Tybalt. And Romeo tries to interfere with the fight, and Tybalt stabs Mercutio, and Mercutio dies. Tragic moment. Tybalt runs off, Romeo not knowing what to do. Tybalt comes back. Romeo, now filled with anger, he's Italian, filled with anger, takes up a sword to fight Tybalt. Tybalt agrees. They go to it. Romeo kills Tybalt, his wife's cousin. And at that moment, you've reached the ultimate conclusion of the proposition. The proposition is, how can this weird affair between these two teenagers, one of whom isn't yet 14, how can this ever work out? And because the proposition of their relationship is crazy, because the involvement of the friar is stupid, because the involvement of the nurse is ridiculous, because of the killing of Mercutio is terrible, because the killing of Tybalt is tragic in terms of their relationship, Romeo suddenly has the most perfect and precise realization of what he's done, and has, I think, the best intermission line: "Oh, I am fortune's fool." And it is at that moment, I believe, and I've directed the play a few times, that I will always put the intermission. Because in the original scene, as Romeo says that and runs off, the entire city of Verona march onto the stage saying, "What's going on here?" And the prince comes on and Romeo gets banished. And the likelihood, the realistic likelihood of that for a modern audience is a little bit too much to bear. But by placing the intermission there, you are bringing to an end the proposition of this crazy love story, and Romeo's realization of where he is in it. I am fortune's fool. Everything has gone wrong. I am not a fool. I am fortune's fool. Fortune is playing a game with me, and I am losing by it. By beginning the second part of the play, the conclusion there, the conclusion begins with the banishment of Romeo, which will lead, in consequence, to Juliet's threatened marriage to Paris, the possibility of committing adultery, excuse me, her fake suicide, Friar John's failure, Romeo's arrival, the killing of Paris. All of that happens as a conclusion to the proposition that's been set up to that moment. Because Romeo's line, "Oh, I am fortune's fool," is not merely a reflection on what has happened, but a prediction of what the conclusion will bring. So, to my mind, where you put an intermission in Romeo and Juliet is literally halfway through a scene and halfway through a conversation. And there's nothing wrong with that. Essentially, it is always the choice of the director. There is always a moment, amongst many other options, a moment where you can arrest the action and give the audience to take it all on board. And the examples I've given, half a dozen examples, are just about every single play of Shakespeare we could go through and find that moment. And I would much encourage you to do exactly that. And when you see Shakespeare, when you see a production, to ask yourself, is that intermission in the right place? Is that the right moment for me to consider? Because that's the name of the game when turning a written text into an active production, that we are always trying to engage the audience's imagination, to excite that imagination, to leave at one point a proposition or a complexity of propositions in the audience's mind. And when they've had time to reflect on all the possible permutations, to bring them back and show them the conclusion. But to show them the conclusion successfully, the audience has to have had that moment to consider what they've seen and to look for conclusions themselves. apart from also the need to take a personal break, which we all need, especially at my age. But in the best sense of the word, we want the audience, we want the play to achieve a climax that is the ultimate conclusion of the propositions that we've set up. So when you are examining a play, when you are looking at that, and as again, I'll talk about the editing of plays and the cutting of plays in a later webinar. But when you are making that fundamental decision, how do we go from 5 to 2? We go from 5 to 2 on the basis that part 1 is a clear and precise proposition that has completed itself, that all the proposals are now in place. And those proposals may be the nature of where the character has come, or the decisions that a character has made, or the result of all the mistakes that the character has made. And that part 2 is how that reaches its conclusion, how that comes to a satisfactory conclusion to answer all the questions that the propositions have made. It's that simple, and believe me, it's that complex. And because very often, even as you're doing it, even as you edit the play and you rehearse the play, you're constantly asking yourself the questions: have I asked all the questions that the writer has given me? And have I answered all the questions that the writer has set up? It's not easy. It is easy and it's not easy, but it is desperately important, because what you're always looking for is balance. What you're always looking for is the perfect arc. And you never achieve perfection. No theatre production ever achieves perfection. But what you're striving for is that pattern that will set the proposition and then give the conclusions. And that's it. So, I'm a bit early, but I have a couple of other notices I want to give you about what's going to be coming up. If you have any questions, there it is. Type them in the chat, and my esteemed colleague will forward them to me. And if you don't want to do that, you can send us an email and send a donation while you're on the topic. We're always interested, and we always try to respond. And I'm actually intrigued if you have if you disagree with any of the points I've made today, because you're allowed to disagree. So next week's webinar won't be me. Thank you, Philomena. Thank you, and I wish you all the whole health for the coming year and in the dreadful times that we live in. Anyway, as I say, next week, my associate producer, Sharon McCune, will be back with a discussion on our next Expand the Canon reading. And that's going to be a play called After Independence. And normally we do these live, but because of the current Omicron situation, the next one is going to be live streamed. Now, it's going to be read live on Sunday, the 23rd of January, which was its original date. And there will be two performances of it at 2 p.m. and at 7 p.m. You can get the link from the website or by emailing us. We'll let you have the link. We hope that this is the only time we'll have to do this, but COVID being COVID, we don't know. But we do want to make sure that our program of readings do take place. After Independence is a remarkable play, and very much following the thing. Sorry, here's a question. Do you think that viewing all of the propositions in Act 1 is more important for you to look, or would your action jump into Act 2 be more important when choosing an intermission point? My choice of the intermission point would depend totally on my simple proposition. Has the proposition of the play been made? And are we starting at the point when the conclusion begins? So in other words, have we got to the end of the beginning, and do we then come back with the beginning of the end? I'm quoting Winston Churchill slightly here, but that, I think, is the best answer I can give you. If all the propositions, when you say Act 1, I presume you mean the first part. If all the propositions have been made by the end of the first part, as I have chosen it, then you then jump into the second half, because theatrically, and that's why I say the perfect example is the King Lear. We get to the end of the first half, the complete destruction of Lear. He is reduced to nothing. We come back with the most remarkable piece of action, the blinding of Gloucester. So dramatically speaking, it's wonderful. But if you take the Romeo and Juliet example of Romeo's I am fortune's fool runs off curtain, we come back, dead bodies all over the stage, the prince is there mourning his own nephew dead and banishing Romeo. It's a very dramatic return. Anyway, back to the reading. After Independence, wonderful play. We're slightly following on the theme. It's a very different play, but following on the theme of the last reading that we did, Cottagers and Indians. But this one is set in Africa, and it poses very interesting questions about identity. And I heartily recommend it. When I first read it, I said, this is one we've got to present. It's a really, really good play. Anyway, Sharon will be here next week in discussion about that particular play. And I do recommend that you join. There it is. Do join us for that. Then after that, for the month after that, not next week, but the following month, we're going to have 4 programs where we're going to look at our theatrical roots, where we're going to go right back to basics. We're going to be discussing Greek theatre and the influence of Greek theatre on all Western theatre for the last 2,500 years. That's a very big topic to cover. I'm not going to do everything, but I want to do 4 programs where we address certain questions about what Greek theatre, how it is, what it is, and what its influences have been. And its influences on from Shakespeare to Beckett have been phenomenal. So that will be a month-long look at Greek theatre in performance, 4-part series. I'm hoping to have guests with me on that one to discuss various aspects in this particular topic. But I think it's about time we went back to our roots. As I said, the winter appeal is still on. We would be most grateful for donations. Your donations are truly important, particularly at this time when box office income, needless to say, is less than we'd hoped for, because we have to reduce audience sizes and people are still nervous of collecting together. So any donation you can send us, every dollar counts. Please consider sending something. We are hoping to hold our gala on March 19th. That'll be from 6 to 10 p.m. At the Point View Hall. Rather beautiful. It's called Point View because it's got a view of the point in Pittsburgh over the Ohio River. It's absolutely stunning in the Carnegie Science Center. That will be a 6 to 10 gala. More information about that on February the 1st, and that's when tickets go on sale. So mark your calendars, 25th anniversary gala. We're going to have, there'll be, apart from anything else, we're going to be giving some awards out at that gala. So I do hope that if you are in Pittsburgh, or if you can get to Pittsburgh, that we will see you there. In the meantime, stay safe, keep testing, and I do hope it doesn't strike you. It's striking so many. I know other theaters have been having a terrible time with it. So far, we have been lucky. I knock on the wood of my bookshelves, but so far it's not hit us too hard. But do take care of yourselves. I hope that you have been vaccinated. If you haven't, please get a vaccination. Take care, and we will see you back here in a week's time. Thanks for being with us. Bye now.